I came from an area, speaking of families, I came from a family an area a lot like this, as a lot of you know. It was actually it was a lot larger of a town. It was 1,800 people, but so a little bit of a metropolis compared to where we are now. But I went to a school a lot like South Knox in that when I would go to school, I typically had teachers who already knew my family. They already knew my older brothers. By the time I got there, there was a reputation for the Brown family, and I was either going to live up to that reputation or I was going to pull down that reputation. But when I walked in, it was already there. I think a lot of you young people right now, you understand a little bit of what that feels like. And some of you who are adults in the room, you remember what that was like, that maybe that teacher that you had your parents, or if they'd been there long enough, or maybe they had an older sibling of yours. Some of you young people right now, you're going to school and that coach or that parent had your parents. And that can either be really good or that can be really bad. Anybody no, I won't have you raise your hand as far as whether or not that experience was really bad. That doesn't seem fair. But I walked in, fortunately I had 3 older brothers they'd cast a pretty good reputation for me. And for the most part, I feel like I kind of kept that reputation going so that I could hand it on to my younger brother. There were some moments I definitely had where I didn't do that. But it was pretty obvious with some of my teachers that they already had an expectation of who Justin Brown was going to be when I walked into that classroom. And it wasn't always something that I liked. It wasn't always like, there were times like, no, I am Justin. I am not Jared, Jason, or John. I need you to understand that I am my own person. And sometimes I pushed back for that very reason because I wanted them to know who I was. And you might understand what that feels like a little bit. I want us this morning to look at what Jesus' introduction into the world would have looked like. We read through the Christmas story every year as a congregation in some form or another. We may not read it verse by verse, but we read through and we talk through the Christmas story. If you come to Christmas Eve, typically that's a time where you're going to hear a heavy part of the Christmas story. You're going to hear big chunks of it read. Maybe you as a family read the Christmas story. And when I say the Christmas story, I'm not talking about 'twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring. I'm talking about that part of, that Christmas story that comes from Scripture, that one that talks about Jesus. But there's a part of the Christmas story that tells us a little bit about his family that my guess is not very many of us spend time reading at Christmas time. We might, and myself included, so I'm not saying like you all are terrible Christians, you should be more like me. This isn't a part where I spend a lot of my time reading. It's usually one time a year as I'm reading through the Bible that I get to this part of the story and I read through it and I keep right on going. And honestly, it's one of those parts of the story that I usually just kind of skim. Like just read the last word of each sentence and just roll right through it. It's found in Matthew chapter 1. So if you want to open up your Bibles this morning, or if you want to use one of those that are in the pew in front of you, you can pull it out to Matthew chapter 1. If you're reading through the Bible all the way straight through, this is the very beginning piece of what you will run into when it comes to the story of Jesus, or at least the life of Jesus as he walked on the earth. We see the account of his life found in what we call the Gospels, the Gospel accounts, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew's the first one. This is right out of the gate. And truthfully, if we're being honest, for a lot of us, this first introduction to Jesus, we find to be kind of boring. And like I said, we roll right through it. We skim right through it. This morning, though, I want us to stop for a moment. And I want us to really look at what is written here. It starts in verse 1 of chapter 1, the historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac. Okay, we're going to stop already. We made it a long ways into this. Abraham. Let me tell you a little bit about Abraham. Abraham was a guy that God came to and said, through you, there's going to be a massive family that's going to come through you. In fact, your family line, your lineage is going to be so big that you're not going to be able to count them because it's going to be bigger than the star. The number is going to be bigger than the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. I'm going to bring this about, my people, through you. That's a big, big promise. That's who Abraham was. As you read through the biblical account, you will so often read, he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You'll read it over and over. He was a big deal in the history of the Israelite people, in the history of the Jewish people. But Abraham also, although he believed the promise that God had given him, he didn't quite trust in God's timing or God's way of bringing about this promise. See, Abraham was married to a woman named Sarah, and they were old, like old, like you're not having babies old. And God says you're going to have a family line that you're not even going to be able to count. And they're just getting older. Until Sarah finally says, hey, here's how we're going to do this. I've got this servant. You're going to sleep with her. You're going to have a child. And that's how this promise is going to be fulfilled. So Abraham, like a good, obedient husband, goes and sleeps with his wife's servant. Men, don't ever do that. Goes and sleep with his wife's servant. This is the introduction to Jesus. Abraham, big promise, didn't quite want to wait for God's timing and God's way of bringing it about. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Well, let's look at Isaac real quick. We're not going to spend as much time on him as we did on Abraham. Isaac is pretty good for not controlling his children. He's not a great father figure if you really look at him. If you look at the way his children interact and the way that he handles it, not a great history starting off here. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Let's look at Jacob for just a moment. I know, we're going to cruise through this, I promise you. Jacob, again, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, Jacob was the second born of Isaac. And as the second born, that means he got a lot less of daddy's stuff when daddy died. So he found a way to trick his way into getting a lot more of that stuff. He stole the inheritance. He tricked his older brother into giving him his inheritance. Because in that culture, the firstborn son got a much larger portion of the inheritance. And Jacob wanted it. And with the help of his mother, he found a way to get it. Great start for these ones that we refer to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Jacob fathers Judah, not my son, but Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers, and Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Well, real quick, we got to stop again. We got to look at Judah real quick. Again, not my son. Judah, he slept with and impregnated his daughter-in-law. But to be fair, he thought she was a prostitute. So it's a much better story than what it really sounds like, right? No, Judah goes and he sleeps with his daughter-in-law because he wasn't fulfilling the promise. He wasn't fulfilling the duties of giving her another one of his sons because they kept dropping over dead with this woman. And, he sleeps with her. He gets her pregnant. He finds out she's pregnant. Wait a second. She's supposed to be saving herself for another one of my sons that I have not given her. But she's supposed to be doing that. She hasn't done her duty. Let's have her killed. Stand-up guy, this Judah. Now, eventually she comes to him and says, no. This is your baby. I was that prostitute that you thought. So she impersonated the prostitute in order to trick him into sleeping with her. We are having a great family line here. We're going to keep on reading, though. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Aram. Aram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Oh, we got to stop on Rahab for a second. Because while Tamar impersonated a prostitute, Rahab actually was a prostitute. That was her way of making a living. But yet we see her name in the line of Jesus. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Well, Ruth herself has a great story. But Ruth comes from a people who the Israelites would have looked down on, would have never talked to, would have shunned, would have thought were like the scum of the earth. See, the Moabite people that Ruth was a part of were known for incest, for animal sacrifice, child sacrifice, or not, sorry, animal sacrifice wasn't a big deal. The Israelites did that. Child sacrifice. And they were people that the Israelites were like, we're going to have nothing to do with. You think like the rivalry between Lincoln and South Knox, or all the Knox County schools is big? This makes that look like nothing. They would not talk to each other. But yet, as you look at the story in the line of Jesus, this woman that they would have looked at and turned their nose on, like, ugh, she shows up in his story. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David. Whew, we have made it through 1/3 of the lineage of Jesus so far. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. Normally what I do is I go, Abraham fathered Isaac, fathered Jacob, fathered Judah, fathered Perez and Zerah, fathered Hezron, fathered. It goes so much faster the way that I normally read this. I don't reread their names. I just keep right on rolling. But then we're going to keep going here. So verse 6, then David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. Ooh, that's a juicy story right there. See, David, he was the one who was promised that there will always be a king on the throne in your family line. They will always be able to look back and say, this line of kings started with David. Well, David, there came this point where David was supposed to go off to war because that's what kings did, but David stayed behind in the palace instead. And I'm going to really briefly run through this story. David's looking down and he sees this woman bathing on top of her roof, and he goes, "Ooh, she looks good." And so David, with the power of the king, said, "Why don't you go ahead and bring her on up to me?" And now, we don't know exactly what happened during that conversation. At best, they both decided to have an affair together. At worst, David raped her. Real stand-up act in David's life. But it gets even better because Bathsheba, this woman, ends up getting pregnant. And rather than just admit what happened, David says, hey, bring her husband back from war, because he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. Bring him back from war so that we can trick him into thinking that this is his baby, because we'll give him a night and he can sleep with his wife and we'll say, hey, congratulations, you got pregnant. But Uriah is a stand-up guy and he won't do it because all of his, his compatriots, his comrades, they're off at war, and that's where he's supposed to be. So David can't convince him to cover up David's lie, so David has him killed. Sleeps with his wife and then has him killed. Uriah was one of his close friends. Not only did he cheat on Uriah, or did he cause Bathsheba to cheat on Uriah, but he had him killed for it. And then out of that, that child died. Without giving all of the story, David ends up marrying Bathsheba and they have another child. That child's name is Solomon. Solomon became king, and we know of him as the one who is the wisest who has ever lived and the richest who has ever lived. He's also the king who led the Israelite people away from God by beginning to worship other gods, by marrying woman after woman after woman after woman and having concubine after concubine after concubine and slowly worshiping each one of their gods that they brought into the relationship. Solomon fathered Rehoboam. Rehoboam fathered Abijah. Now we're going to start rolling here. Abijah fathered Asa. Asa fathered Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat fathered Joram. Joram fathered Uzziah. Uzziah fathered Jotham. Jotham fathered Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Hezekiah. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. Manasseh fathered Ammon. Ammon fathered Josiah. And Josiah fathered Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. These kings had done such a good job that their country was exiled and taken captive by another country. That's how good they were at what they were called to do. Then after the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah fathered Shealtiel. Shealtiel fathered Zerubbabel. Remember what I've told you before? If you say them confidently, no one knows that you said them wrong. Zerubbabel fathered Abiud. Abiud fathered Eliakim. Eliakim fathered Azor. Azor fathered Zadok. Zadok fathered Achim. Achim fathered Eliud. Eliud fathered Eleazar. Eleazar fathered Mathan. Mathan fathered Jacob. And Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. How many of you spend time on Christmas Eve reading through that part of the Christmas story? That's kind of what I thought. And I don't think this is one of those where we're like, we don't want to raise our hands because we don't raise our hands in church. I think this one is an honest answer. I don't read that part to my kids. I'm not faulting you for it. I'm not making you feel guilty about it. It looks like a boring story. But when we read through the lineage of Jesus, what we see is ancestor after ancestor after ancestor turns their back on God until finally we get to Mary. And Mary is someone that God comes to and says, hey, you have found favor. God looks highly upon her, but that's not what everybody else would have thought of Mary. I mean, imagine walking around, you're an unwed mother, you're pregnant, you're obviously pregnant, you're like, no, I'm not like David and Bathsheba, I'm not like Judah and Tamar, this is God's baby. Who's gonna believe you when you say this is God's baby? Now, at best, they think that you and Joseph got together sooner than you were supposed to. At worst, they think Joseph had nothing to do with this. And in that society, it wasn't a, hey, let's come alongside you and help you raise this child, or let's take you to a clinic to get rid of the child. In that society, it was, let's get rid of you. Let's take your life. That's how low they would have thought of Mary. In the world that Jesus walked into, that's what they would have thought of his mother. And his father? Well, they would have just looked at him like, you are a sucker. Like, what are you doing? You're still gonna marry this woman? Are you serious? You should have her killed. There's a lot of money being made today by people wanting to go back and look at their ancestry. By people wanting to look back and see, where did I come from? Where did I originate? Ancestry.com is a big deal right now. And there's others too. That's just the one that I can think of. So we are kind of in a stage in our country and in our world where we're starting to place some more significance on where we came from. We went through a pretty big chunk where it's like, we didn't know, we didn't care. We just knew that at one point we lived overseas as a family and now we live over here. But people are starting to put more emphasis into that. In the world that Jesus came into, family line meant everything. I mean, you think about the reputation that your older siblings or your parents made for you in school, if you had any of them come before you in school. Jesus traces his back generations. Not just, hey, you had my mom or my dad, or you knew my grandparents. But they would trace them back centuries. And if it was good, then it was good. Like your life was off to a great start. But if it wasn't, it was going to be really hard to get any higher up that ladder. See, Jesus' family is full of influential people. There's kings in it, there's Abraham, there's Isaac, there's Jacob, but it's full of influential failures. As people in the Israelite community would think back to that list of kings that I really sped through there, they would have thought, wow, those kings, they were major mess-ups. In fact, one of the reasons that we are in the position that we're in right now is because of your family. Maybe if your ancestors had done better, then our people wouldn't be in slavery right now. Our people wouldn't be under the oppression of the Romans. It wouldn't have been one where Jesus would have been like, hey, guess who my great-granddaddy is? No. This would have been a world in which he would have wanted to stay under the radar when it came to who all of his ancestors were. Yeah, sure, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they kind of brushed over some of their indiscretions. David, they brushed over some of his indiscretions. Those men, They confessed of what they had done and they had come back to God, but man, there was a lot in there that was terrible. Jesus' family tree was full of influential failures. It's almost as if Jesus comes on the scene. He says, hey, my name's Jesus. I come from a messed up family full of messed up people who did messed up things. My great ×5 grandmother, she pretended that she was a prostitute to seduce her own father-in-law. That same father-in-law, well, he lied to her, thought she was a prostitute, got her pregnant, and almost had her killed. My great ×4 grandmother actually was a prostitute. My great ×3 grandmother came from a long line of incest, perverts, and idol worshipers. My great ×4 grandfather, he had an affair, maybe involving rape, and tried to cover it up by having one of his closest friends killed. And my own mother was accused of awful things and called every name in the book. Now, maybe your family has one of those black sheep in the family that nobody likes to talk about. Or maybe, you can think of some people who have come before you in your family that, okay, you don't necessarily totally shun them, but they have that piece in their history that, well, we just don't talk about that at Christmas. We just don't talk about what Uncle so-and-so did 20 years ago because that's kind of a stain on the family, and so we're just going to brush over that one. Or parents, maybe you're thinking of something your children have done, we don't really want everybody in the community to know about that one. Well, unfortunately, you live in Knox County, and everybody knows everything that you ever did. I grew up in a place just like it. I know how it goes. There is one secret that I'm still not sure my parents know, and someday I might ask them. But we've all got it. Jesus, on the other hand, was full of those people. His family line was full of black sheep. His family line was full of the things that so-and-so did that we just don't talk about at Christmas time. If ever anyone had some family baggage, it was Jesus. I love how Max Lucado says it. He says that Jesus entered our world not like a human, but as a human. See, if I was God, and if one of you was God, likely what we would probably look at is, hey, if we're going to enter this world, let's set ourselves up for success. If anybody could have set himself up to come from a powerful family, from a powerful place, to have all kinds of influence from the very beginning, I would think that God would be the one who could do that. But he didn't. He didn't manipulate the circumstances so that at the moment of his birth, everyone would look at him and everyone would be paying attention to him. And I think maybe part of the reason of that is that he wants us to know 2,000 years later that he is not just for the people in the bigger houses. God is not just for the wealthy. He is not just for the powerful. He is not just for the influential. He is not just for the people who don't have all that ugly family history. He is not just for the people who have their own baggage, but that through Jesus, we see that God isn't a God who is out to get us like we are so often told, but instead, he is a God who actually gets us. His circumstances could have been so much different. But instead, we read in Hebrews chapter 4 that Jesus is not out of touch with our reality. He's been through weakness and testing. He's experienced it all but the sin. So let's walk up to him and get what he is so ready to give. Take the mercy and accept the help. Jesus is not out of touch with our reality. Your family has a bad reputation, and let's face it, if your family has history around here, everybody knows it. Unless you came from out of town, like mine, you don't know a lot of my family history. If you grew up around here, people know your family history. And if it's not great, he gets it. He understands it. Your family doesn't have much possession to give you. You're not going to inherit a whole lot, or you're just going to inherit a bunch of bills. He gets it. He understands it. Your family has some sketchy origin stories. He gets it. Or maybe you feel like you're pigeonholed into a certain life, whether that be good or bad. And let's face it, there are some of us, our families have a great reputation, and we are expected to just walk into that same role that they're using right now, that same occupation, and we don't want it. But it's expected of us. If you're pigeonholed into a certain life, Jesus would have understood that too. Or maybe you're in here and you feel like you're limited to what your life can look like because you're from nowhere. Monroe City, Vincennes, Washington, Petersburg, Bicknell, Bruceville. I know I forgot some in there. Let's face it, they don't show up on the map. When moving out here, we would tell people, hey, we're going to move to a place called Monroe City, or, we actually end up living in Wheatland, and people would go, where is that? Well, it's over by Vincennes. What? Well, it's close to Evansville. Where? It's 2 hours from Indianapolis. Oh, okay. Which direction? South. There's something down there? I mean, those were the responses I got. Actually, there was a conversation that we had when we began telling people, hey, we're going to move to Monroe City, Indiana, and we're going to go to Monroe City First Church of God, again, places that they'd never heard of, where we had an individual come to us and say, you're going to go waste your talents there. That there is so much more than you can do in a little place in the middle of nowhere. Now, that's not what we thought. Obviously, we're here. So I want you to hear very clear, that's not what we thought. But you better believe that's what people think of little out in the middle of nowhere places. I mean, I grew up in one of those places. Waukene, Kansas is not a place that people have heard of. And when I try to explain it to them, I say it's close to Hays. Don't know where that is. Okay, it's 2 hours away from Wichita. Well, Salina. Now, with today's speeds, Wichita. Oh, okay. They still don't know where it is. But they act like they do. So I finally say it's exactly in between Kansas City and Denver. Now they've got an idea. So I know what it feels like. Sarah grew up in Casper, Wyoming, which admittedly is a much bigger town. I mean, it's 50 to 60,000 people. And yet still all people think of is you ride a horse to school and there's more antelope than there are human beings. That part is actually true. The horse part is not. So church, we get what it's like to come from a place that people look at and they say, what are you going to do? We get what it's like to be from a place that you feel like your options are limited. And you know who else would get that? Jesus. In fact, there were moments where people would actually say, he's from Nazareth. Quoted, nothing good comes from Nazareth. Jesus understood. His family line shows us that he understands us. Where he chose to come from shows that he understands us. Or maybe for you, it's not your family baggage. Maybe for you, it's not where you're from. Maybe for you, it's your own baggage. Maybe for you, it's sitting there thinking about what I've done. And I'm from a place where everybody knows what I've done. And they won't let me move past it. Well, I can't say that Jesus gets that part completely. Because the truth is, Jesus never made a mistake. Jesus didn't sin. But what I can tell you about him is that he came here for those mistakes. He came so that he could pick up our baggage and carry it for us. So while he may not get my personal baggage and my personal mistakes, he's offered to take it for me. Jesus began with his big intro to the world by saying, here I am. There's a lot of baggage in my family. But Jesus finished by saying, guess what? God, my Father, he still used my messed up family. He's going to use me, and he can still use you. As you look through that story of all of those people in his lineage, yes, Abraham made some terrible mistakes. Isaac made some terrible mistakes. Jacob, Judah, all the way down the list. You can see, man alive, what a bunch of messed up people. And yet God still brought about the Savior of the world through that family. God doesn't give up. And God doesn't hold against us what people will hold against us. He came not to move into the bigger houses and not to draw us to the bigger houses. We've been, for the last 3 weeks, talking about what true happiness looks like, what true happiness really is. And we've described this, or I've described this, I guess I should say, as someone who is full of peace, who is joyful, who is hopeful, and who is full of love. We talk about those things every Christmas. Peace, joy, hope, and love. And when we're full of those things, I think most of us we would say, yes, that is true happiness. That is being filled. That is being on cloud nine, whatever words you want to use. We define bigger houses as anything, person, or place that we expect to fill us with that happiness. I've been putting together a little house up here that is not great. And this morning, we've decorated that little house. You want to know what this really is? The decorations? It's lipstick on a pig. You're not going to find happiness in that house. You're not going to find happiness in any bigger house. That's what bigger houses promise us. They put lipstick on a pig. They say, hey, come here, come here, come here, come look at me, come be with me, come walk with me. I'm going to give you all these promises, but all it's doing is covering up the emptiness that's behind it. Happiness isn't found in the big gifts. The big gifts under the tree, they're going to make some big promises, and they're not going to fulfill them. It's going to be lipstick on a pig. Happiness is not found in the addictions that we struggle with. No matter what it is that they promise us, they always come up empty. Happiness is not found in power. It wasn't found in the palace then. It's not found in the palaces of our world today. And happiness is not found in our ancestry. Jesus came from a really messed up family tree. And some of us come from some messed up family trees. In fact, if we look back far enough, we all come from some messed up family trees. It's not found in the best sex. It's not found in alcohol. It's not found in the perfect body or a better education or retirement or the perfect marriage. Happiness is only found in the Word who became flesh and took up residence among us. And for us to receive that happiness, the best way that I have ever found and the best way that I read in Scripture is to worship. Because when we begin to worship Him, when we put our focus on Him, what it does is it draws us away from all of those other places that we are looking for our happiness. It puts all of our focus on Him, the hope giver, the one who is love, the one who is the peacemaker, the one who found joy even in the worst of circumstances. And it doesn't have to stop when we leave this building in a few minutes. Worship is not just done through song. Worship is done whenever we look to Him and we acknowledge who He is and what He has done. Church, happiness isn't found in bigger houses, but the source from which it comes freely gives it to each and every person who will come to His feet and say, that's what I want. So this Christmas, our choice, as it is every Christmas, and as it will be the day after Christmas, and the day after that, and the week after that, and the month after that, is where will we really search for our happiness? My prayer is that we will choose to enter into worship, and we will find our happiness in the only one who can give it.